Remember, the equilibrium is when demand equals supply, right? However, in the macroeconomics, we have two supply curves. Therefore, we should be able to find two equilibria. So what is the short-run equilibrium? Well, it's when aggregate demand meets short-run aggregate supply curve. This is the macroeconomic short-run equilibrium. Remember, we are always in a short run. Therefore, the short run equilibrium is where we are producing right now. Say, for example, in this example, now we are producing at 10 and the price level is 105. We are producing at the short run equilibrium. We are not necessary in the long run. Remember, the long run is conceptual. It is producing at the potential GDP level. It is not necessary for us to produce at the potential GDP level at any time. You don't always lift 100 pounds every day, every second. Okay? Sometimes you lift more than your potential. Sometimes you lift at your potential. Sometimes you lift lower than your potential. So this is where we are producing now, and this number can be higher than potential GDP, lower than potential GDP, or equal to the potential GDP. When we are producing a level, that is the short-run equilibrium, if we are producing at a level at the potential GDP level, then we say we are in a macroeconomic long run equilibrium. So long run equilibrium is for all three curves, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, meet together. Let me say it again. What we are producing now is where aggregate demand meets short run aggregate supply curve. If what we are producing now is at the potential GDP level, then we are also at the long run aggregate supply curve. Then we are in a macroeconomic long run equilibrium. After drawing all the graphs, all the curves, and understanding what causes a movement, what causes a shift, now we want to learn how to find new equilibrium, right? Okay, with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, by shifting curves, we can learn three things, three topics in macroeconomics. The first one is economic growth, economic long-run growth. We can also learn business cycle. The short-run fluctuation. And we can also learn inflation rates. Inflation. Inflation is a long-run phenomenon. Okay? So we are going to use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram to study long-run economic growth, short-run economic fluctuations, that is business cycle, and the variable on the y-axis, the change in price level, that is inflation. So let's talk about the first one. Economic growth. What causes economic growth? We have talked about this before. That is, your potential increases. When potential GDP increases, long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Potential GDP increases. That is the definition of economic growth. So what causes economic growth? The answer is labor, capital, technology. So only the advanced in labor, capital, technology can make an economy grow. Second, what causes business cycle? Business cycle occurs because aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curve fluctuates. Remember, long-run aggregate supply curve will cause economic growth. So there are only three graphs on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. Demand, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply curve. Change in long-run aggregate supply curve will cause economic growth. Therefore, what will cause business cycle? The answer is the other two, aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. Money wage does not change rapidly enough. Why? If money wage changes proportionally to the change in the price level, then that will be in the long run, right? But in the short run, nominal wage does not change rapidly to keep real GDP at potential GDP. Then we will see fluctuations in the economy. So what causes business cycle? That is, what causes short-run equilibrium to deviate from long-run equilibrium? This is the short-run equilibrium. This is the long-run equilibrium. What causes the short-run equilibrium to deviate from the long-run equilibrium? Remember, long-run equilibrium must be on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So how can the economy deviate from the long-run equilibrium? Only two possibilities. Number one, aggregate demand curve shifts. Number two, aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply curve shifts. Right? Let me say it again. How can this point go away from the long-run aggregate supply curve? One possibility, aggregate demand curve shifts. Then this is the new equilibrium. Second possibility, short-run aggregate supply curve shifts. Then this is the new equilibrium. In both cases, we deviate from the long-run equilibrium. All right, now let's talk about this one by one. Fluctuation in aggregate demand is the first one. The second one is fluctuation in short-run aggregate supply curve. All right? So an increase in aggregate demand caused by what? I put 3 question marks here. I want you to answer this. Have you learned this? The answer is yes. What causes aggregate demand curve to shift? Anything else other than the change in the price level, right? Anything else that changes aggregate demanders' behavior. What is aggregate demanders' behavior? Aggregate expenditures. So anything that changes aggregate expenditures. What are aggregate expenditures? CIGXM. Anything that changes CIGXM, that is, it will change aggregate expenditure, will change the behavior of the aggregate demanders. Therefore, it will shift aggregate demand curve. So what changes the aggregate expenditure? Remember, expectation, policies, and world economy. Remember these? Expectations. If you expect your income to be higher, you expect to be drafted in the next NBA draft, what should you do now? Buy a Hummer. If you expect toilet paper price, expected inflation to be higher, then what do you do now? Buy toilet papers. If Ford expect the profit to be higher, what should they do now? Invest more. Right? Policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies. So for fiscal policies, if there's a tax cut or increase in government spending, aggregate demand curve shift to the right. Monetary policy, when the Fed increases money supply or cut the interest rates, aggregate demand curve shift to the right. Right? World economy, when exchange rate goes down, domestic currency depreciates, export increases, import decreases. And foreign income increases, people are going to buy more of our exports. So these will cause an increase in aggregate demand. When aggregate demand shifts to the right, price level rises. But nominal wage is fixed in the short run. Real wage is nominal wage divided by price level. When price level increases, nominal wage does not adjust quickly. Real wage goes down. Therefore, it will cause a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve, and we reach a new short-run equilibrium, and we deviate from the long-run equilibrium. So price level increases, output level increases. We call the difference between the output, between the actual output and the potential output. If the actual output is higher than the potential output, we say that the economy has an inflationary gap. This gap, 0.5, is called inflationary gap because we are producing at a level higher than our potential. We are producing too much. That will give the economy a pressure, an inflation pressure to push the price up, further up. That is why this gap is called inflationary gap, because it gives the economy a pressure on the price level. Why? Because when price level is higher, okay, I'm going to say this 100 times in this class. When price level is higher, workers renegotiate their wages, therefore short-run aggregate supply curve shift to the left. Let me say it again. When price level increases, workers renegotiate their wages, short-run aggregate supply curve shift to the left. Let me say it again. When price level increases, Apple becomes more expensive. Then Donna Summer is going to renegotiate her wages with her boss to ask for a higher wage. Remember, nominal wage and oil price, these two terms will shift short-run aggregate supply curve. So when nominal wage increases, short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. That is the inflationary pressure that I was talking about. So short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and go back to the original equilibrium. Let me do it all over again. When aggregate demand curve shift to the right because of any of the factors, price increases, output increases. The economy has an inflationary gap. It is going to push the price level even higher. Why? Because when price level increases, workers are going to renegotiate their wages. Therefore, nominal wage will go up. When nominal wage goes up, short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. By how much? Until they are willing to work 8 hours per day and produce at potential. Therefore, we go back to the long-run equilibrium. Now, are you seeing the business cycle here? We goes from 10 to 10.5 and go back to 10. That is why a shift in aggregate demand curve will cause business cycle. You just see half of the cycle here. Now, the second way to generate a business cycle is a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Say for example, short-run aggregate supply curve shift to the left by what? Question mark. Answer: what can shift short-run aggregate supply curve to the left but not shifting long-run aggregate supply curve? Answer: only two things. Nominal wage and oil price. Say for example, OPEC increases the oil price. What happened? Our short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. When short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, price level increases, bad. Output decreases, bad. We are producing the new short-run equilibrium. We are producing at 9.5, which is lower than the potential, 10. So we are producing at a level lower than our potential. We say that we are in a recessionary gap because we are in a recession. So this gap is called recessionary gap. And the combination of higher inflation and lower output is called stagflation. It's bad plus bad. Remember, when aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, price goes up, bad. Output increases, that's okay. But here, both price increases and output decreases. That's really bad. So stagflation is a very bad condition. Then what will happen next? We will talk more about this later, but let me just give you a basic idea what will happen next. Well, the economy has to go back to the long-run equilibrium. How can the economy go back to the long-run equilibrium? Two ways to do it. Number one, aggregate demand shift to the right. Then we go back to the original equilibrium. That is, we use some policies to shift aggregate demand curve to the right. The second possibility is for short-run aggregate supply curve to shift back to the original level. How can we do that? Well, workers renegotiate their wages at a lower level. They are willing to accept a lower wage. Then short-run aggregate supply curve will shift back. Then you can see the business cycle. Goes from here to here, goes from 10 to 9.5 and come back to 10. That is why fluctuations in the short-run aggregate supply curve can generate a business cycle. Number three, we can also see inflation in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. So what causes inflation? What causes inflation? The answer is when aggregate demand curve shifts rightwards faster than the rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. Say for example, if long-run aggregate supply curve shift from LA_0 to LA_1, if the demand curve shift by the same amount, what will happen? The new long-run equilibrium is here, and the price level doesn't change. So the only way that you will see a higher price level is when the aggregate demand curve shifts more than the long-run aggregate supply curve. Remember, inflation is a long-run phenomenon. So in the long run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. But if aggregate demand increases more than the increase in long-run aggregate supply, we are going to see a higher price level. Next, we are going to spend the whole chapter 12 to talk about inflation. All right, let me show you a pretty cool graph. Each dot is a Shorron equilibrium of the United States in 1 year. Say, for example, in 1960, we are producing right here. And this is the long-run aggregate supply curve in 1960. So in this year, we are producing at this level, and the price level in that year is this. So one dot represents one Shorron equilibrium in the United States history. So as you can see, this is aggregate demand curve in 1960. This is Shorron aggregate supply curve in 1960. This is the long-run aggregate supply curve in 1960. So what can you say about the US economy in the year of 1960? The answer is, in the 1960, we are in a long-run equilibrium. Now, how about 2005? This is the aggregate demand curve in 2005. This is Shorron aggregate supply curve in 2005. So in 2005, we were producing at 11.1. But the long-run aggregate supply curve in 2005 is 11.3, this one. Therefore, in 2005, we are producing at a level lower than our potential. So let me talk about this all over again. The demand and supply diagram can show us 3 topics in macroeconomics. Economic growth. How can you see that from this graph? This is the rightward shift of long-run aggregate supply curve. That shows you the economic growth. How can you see the business cycle? Well, are you seeing the business cycle here? It's fluctuating. Can you see the inflation here? Yes. The price level keep going up and up. That is the inflation. So from the demand and supply diagram, we can see the evolution of the US economy.